So let's say we have some text and we wanted to adjust it. Now, if we have the text type tool here active, we can just click inside of whatever text we have, and that will allow us to change things by using the options bar at the top of the screen. But sometimes you'll want to not just change one thing. For example, just by clicking in here, I can change the font size, but you'll see that nothing is changing. And that's because even though it's active, and you can tell because we have this little baseline underneath it, even though it's active, it's not selected. So double clicking a word, for example, will highlight it. And from there, we can adjust the point size of that word, and that will adjust the entire size of all of it. But sometimes you don't want to adjust just one thing, you want to adjust everything. If you go over to the Layers menu and double click on the icon, the T icon on the type, it will actually highlight everything, and then you can go in and adjust all of it in one go. And I'm, again, just adjusting the point size. There are a few ways to do that. You'll notice that the drop-down has a number of common sizes readily available, such as 9, 10, 11, 12, all the way up to 72. But if you want, you can instead go a little to the left and mouse over this icon of the small t and the big T. You'll see that you get an on-screen adjustment hand tool with 2 arrows on either side. From here, you can drag left and right, and you can see I can go past the 72 point size. I can go very far past the 72 point size. I believe the maximum is, about 1,296 points. So at this point, we can't really see what's going on. And if we click, we can see the current point size, and we could go back to the original, and it will have the previous one. So there'll be 1,296. We can also type in here. So if we wanted, for example, to do 23.78 point size, we could do that, 23.78. Press enter, and voila, it becomes that point size. We can also do things like grab the Alt key when we drag to go by a smaller amount. The Shift key will jump it by a considerable amount. Goes all the way down to 0.01 point. And I'm just going to bring it back to 72 here so that we've got something to work on. So we can change the size of anything that's selected. So if we'd like, we can highlight individual words and change the point size of them one at a time. This can be useful if you want to, do a children's book and have the text slowly increase. And to reset it, you can just highlight the entire part. I'm just triple clicking to get the entire row. Notice that I have an enter here, a return. This is called a line break, or a carriage return line feed if you're in the computer industry. So if I triple click, it will go to that point and highlight everything. And now I can just choose whatever point size I want. But rather than doing that, I can also choose my move tool and do a free transform with Control T. And you'll notice we get all of the free transform tools, and it's got an interpolation, but that doesn't matter quite as much. As long as you constrain it, it will increase the entire text just as it would with the font size. I believe, though, we can, let's zoom out quite a lot. We can see that we still have, and hopefully I won't crash the program, we still have the same size limitation of 1,296 point of size here. And again, 72 points is an inch. And in this case, it's much slower to do the transformation. Now, the reason that the free transform has that limitation is because we're not actually working with standard raster graphics like we would with everything else inside of the program. The text is actually a vector graphic, just as we've done earlier in the semester when we were working with masks to create paths using the pen tool, using paths like through the pen tool to create masks. So I said that completely backwards. So one more time. By using the pen tool to create paths, we could make masks. The pen tool was laying down vectors, and we've covered that. Text, by default, is a vector object. Now this is going to take forever to transform, so I'm just going to use some movie magic so that you don't have to watch this. Movie magic. Let's take a look. We're going to zoom in here, and you'll see that it's really crisp even as we zoom in, and in fact until we get to the point where Photoshop has to create pixels, it's really like very neat and tidy. Now if we increase the size, let's just use the font increase because my word, that transformation took a while. If we increase the size to say 10 times that, this should create some sort of unmanageable warping to things, except it won't because again, it's a vector image. Let's zoom in on this curve. Look, the curve is still perfect. It's still the same 2 pixels of gradation to create the anti-aliasing. It's not blurry at all. Again, this is because it's vector graphics, which also has something interesting. It means that we can edit this after the fact for many of the transformations that we do with it. So if we were to perform free transform on this again, Control T, while we have the move tool here, we can do things like increase the size vertically by depending on your version of Photoshop, you may need to hold down Shift key, or you may need to not hold down Shift key, depending on what version you're in. Let me move this over. And this won't cause any distortion beyond, the transformation itself. See how crisp everything still is as we zoom in? There's, in fact, if we get to it, we could see that it still has a nice tight gradation going on to create the anti-aliasing. So we could do more extreme transformations as well. Holding down the Control key, I can shear all of this. And if I Control Alt, I can shear it on both ends. Press Enter to accept it. And once all this is done, it's still editable. We could call the very lazy dog, and it's right in there. And so we can do all sorts of transformations. In fact, we can go in, back to the Move tool, do another Control T, and go over to the, instead of the free transform, we can go to the warp mode. And once we're in the warp mode, we can choose a type of warp, such as the arc. Let me shrink the text down before we do this, or we're not going to be able to see what we're doing. Just undo a couple of times. Here we go. And go back to the Move tool, Control T to transform. Switch it over from free transform to warp mode. Once I'm in warp mode, I can choose what type of warp I want, such as a lower arc, and that will give me controls similar to the pen tool. I'm going to turn off the lower layer so we can see what's happening there, and we can do another Control T, and we can apply another warp, and we'll see that it's remembered it, much as it would have with a smart object, which is something very interesting with the text, is that these edits are non-destructive. Keep in mind when we're in the warp, we can change the warp's orientation, so we can have kind of a Back to the Future feel to it, going, oh, wrong tool. We can also have like this kind of crazy effect, and you'll want to keep these things in mind while you're working on your project this week. So you might want to do some really wild stuff with transformations. So I'm just going to shrink that down, Alt key to shrink from the middle. You can see that we can get some very interesting and fun transformations with. So the transformations alone, with just again Control T, can unlock a number of fascinating effects for text. Now, I'm going to say something maybe a little controversial. I believe that you have 2 modes of text. It's either legible or illegible. There's no magic in between where it's kind of legible. It's either meant to be read or it's not meant to be read. And if it's meant to be read, you must be careful when you're doing transformations. It's very easy to warp it to a point where it's not legible. And it's even easier to convince yourself that it's still legible because you'll look at it and go, yeah, no, I know what this says. Well, you may know what it says because you typed it out, not necessarily because it can be read. I, for example, would not say that these first 2 words, the quick, are legible at all. brown, maybe. Fox, definitely. On the bottom side, I would argue that until you get to lazy, it's not legible. But that doesn't mean you can't use it as a decoration. You can just admit that it's not legible text, and you can enjoy it for what it is. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Let's go back in here and perform another transformation. Control T, and I'm sorry, I was in the text tool. I need to change to the move tool. Control T, and I'm going to go back to the transform and warp modes, and I'm going to set this to none to get us back to standard text. I'm going to press the check mark up in the options bar. And don't forget, by the way, if you're in that transformation mode and you're in the warp, you can change where it's warping by clicking on these minuscule little dots. And if you mouse over this, it should say toggle the reference point. So now if we were to do, for example, the inflate, and then change the dot on the inflate, you can see that it's recalculating, but inflate is symmetrical, it's radially symmetrical, so we won't notice a change. Whereas if we change it to, I think the fish should work fairly well with this. We have the this fish shape coming out, and we actually need to stretch the fish a bit more so that we can see that transformation. And squash the fish, holding down the Shift and the Alt key for the version of Photoshop I'm in. All right, so this is supposed to be kind of a cute fish shape. Control T again, go to warp. Now we can see it. It looks more like a vase, but there you have it. Now that we've got the fish, we can change the reference point. And then when we do switch between it, back and then back to the fish, it's supposed to rotate. But it looks like in this version, it's not going to. Well, that's unfortunate. So we're just stuck with that fish point. Oh, well. Such is life. Depending on the version of Photoshop, that should actually alter where it is. We can see here, at least, when we're not doing the warp, as I click along the lines, it is moving the reference point around. And that means that it will change where it's shrinking from or growing from. So if I were to do something like a rotation, it would spin on that point. So over here, if I move it up, you can spin it differently. So keep that reference point in mind. Let's get back in here. So we've got this fish. Let's change this to maybe a wavy flag. It does seem to be somewhat correct. There we go. Here we go. Change the wave. So we've got the wave, and in here we can change the bend. We can flip the bend around. If we so desire, we can increase or decrease it by dragging the on-screen tools. We can also increase the height and the width if we so desire. Same rules as with all of these little dialog boxes in Photoshop. The arrow keys will allow you to move up and down. Shift arrow keys will jump higher. Alt arrow keys will jump smaller. You can drag on the text, and you can instead just type in something like 100%. So you can get a crazy transformation going on. But there's one more thing. If we come in and get the type tool here, and then highlight our text or double click on the text to select it all, we have this create warped text option. And when we bring this up, the warp text is the same as the transformation warp. And so we could select our fish again, and we could adjust the bend, but you'll notice that the transformation we did with the shearing is still in effect. So you'd have to reverse that if you wanted it to be clean and easy to do. Now on the move tool, we don't have the changes done. It's in the transform, and that's a bit tricky. So let me zoom around a little bit. No reason for you to, or not. We'll just, we'll leave it. All right. So it's in the transform. Now, the question is, where in the transform is it stored? We have the positions of where everything is. So if we had like the top left corner positioned over at 0 pixels and the top left corner positioned over at 0 pixels, we we see that that's still not the shearing that we have. We have 100% and 100%. We have 0% or 0 degrees on the rotate. Height and horizontal and vertical skew both say 0, but we know that we have in fact done horizontal skew on this, and if I bring it over, it goes through. And that's the issue. This is all perfectly reversible. And you can see the X and the Y here, and the properties aren't even giving us too much of a hint. This is all reversible, but we're having to eyeball it. And partially because it's not a smart object. So we don't have easy access to where that transformation is. It's been applied. So there's still a slight skew on here. So what you can do is come in. I'm just going Control A to select all. You can come in, go over to the warp text and set it to none. And we can quickly see that skew and transformation, even though we're not spotting it in the adjustments themselves. So if I do a Control T on here, or in fact with the type tool, hold down the Control key, that will give me some tools such as resizing. There we go. And once I'm in there, you can see that I've got the skew, but it says that 0 degrees is the original edit, not the unedited form. So I'll just come in here and do an adjustment. There we go. And now I can eyeball it and get it going. This is a lot of work, and there's actually a much faster way to do this involving the paragraph styles and the layer styles, the paragraph styles and the character styles. We'll cover that in a little bit. Essentially, you just copy it over and then get it in. And so that's a bit better, but we still have some transformation occurring. All right, so I suppose the point is, if you're doing things like shearing, be careful. You can end up with it kind of trapped. If we brought up the ruler and we created some, I did a pretty good job on shearing it. Not so much over here. It's still a little off. I'm just using some guides. All right, so in short though, we do have transformation tools available to us at the very low level. We can select the type tool and select all by either double clicking or by highlighting whatever we want, or highlighting all of it. From there, we can do the warp text pop-up, or the warp text edit here. You can do things like a bulge, and then you'll have things like the bend and the horizontal distortion, which can go positive or negative. You'll have the vertical distortion, and you can also get to all this through the move tool and Control T, or that's the same thing as edit, transform, free transform, or sorry, edit, transform, free transform these days, Control T. And again, you can do skews, and you can shear and all that good stuff. You can make edits that are very difficult to remove later if you so choose. You can press enter. And you can also do things like flip it with edit, transform, flip horizontally, edit, transform, flip vertically if you wanted. You can also skew and rotate directly in here if you so desired. All that good stuff is just available to you. So this is just the tip of the text editing iceberg in Photoshop. So let's start diving into a few more things you can do with your text.